The drums alliteration are Emu's real problem, because Emu's power seems to be themed around control. He doesn't just utterly terrorize people, he takes their bodies, buries their identities, and turns them into extensions of his own will. But Gear 5 moves in the opposite direction. Luffy's body becomes harder to tame. His heartbeat changes into a real rhythm other characters can hear, and that rhythm is the drums of liberation. The biggest clue is Brook, because Brook may be showing us what sound can really do in One Piece. It can reach buried emotions, and it may help a person's real self answer back. So if Brook can reach Shuri inside Gunko, then the drums alliteration may be the larger version of that same idea, a real sound that reaches what Emu's control tries to bury. So the first clue is that Emu's power isn't just about being a freaking god, it's about control. But it's not the same control that we've seen from someone like Doflamingo. Doflamingo controlled people like puppets. He pulled their bodies around from the outside. Emu's control seems way worse because it goes deeper than that. Doflamingo can move your body. Emu seems to replace the will inside it. That's the difference. When someone falls under Emu's influence, they don't just become a stronger version of themselves, they become less themselves. And that's where my 5 elders hockey theory might help explain things, because in that theory, I argued that Emu's covenant may not truly empower people, it's more like preserving them, freezing them in place, and turning them into vessels for Emu's will. I don't want to fully recap that theory here because apparently we're trying to finish this video before the heat death of the universe, but the basic idea matters. If that theory is even close, then Emu's greatest power may not be fully destroying everything in sight. It may be ownership. His system takes a person and turns them into something he can use. And that's why the 5 elders feels like 5 separate individuals at times, and more like one will moving through 5 bodies, like they're the delightful children from down the lane. And that is why Shuri seems like an important character right now in the Elbaf arc, because with Shuri still buried inside somewhere in her Gunko persona, then Emu's control isn't just making her fight, it's forcing another will over her real self. So the first point is pretty simple. Emu's control isn't just only physical, it tries to erase the person underneath. And if the drums of liberation are going to be Emu's biggest weakness, they need to reach that exact place, the will Emu is trying to bury, whether it be a person or the entire world itself. Once you understand Emu's control that way, the next pattern becomes really easier to see. Emu does not just control people, Emu also controls what people are allowed to remember. The clearest example is the Void Century. 800 and 900 years of history were erased from the world, not just hidden, erased. And that matters because a world without that history can't learn from it, can't question it, or use it to push back. The same idea applies to Nika. Most people don't even know the real name of Luffy's fruit. They know it as the Gama Gama no Mi, but that name was a cover. The fruit was renamed so the world would not know what it really was. So the pattern is pretty clear. History gets erased, names get changed, truth gets buried, and with Shuri still somewhere inside Gunko, then that same idea may be happening to a person. Her real self exists, but another identity has been overwriting it. That is what silence means in the story. It means the truth is still there, but the world is being trained not to hear it. That's why the drums of liberation is important in this discussion. If Emu's system creates silence, then the drums create the opposite problem. It disrupts the silence. It makes people notice something that was supposed to stay buried. So the contrast is simple. Emu's side hides history, names, and identity. The drums of liberation bring attention back to what was hidden. But silence may be the only first layer. Hiding something is one thing. Keeping it stuck in one place sounds worse. And that is why the preservation idea for my 5 elders hockey theory matters here, where I made the point about Emu's covenant preserving people by freezing them. Particularly, and I didn't mention this, their souls. Of course, it's just a theory, but I think it has enough credence to give us a useful way to read Emu's power. Because if Emu's system works that way, then it does more than hide a person's real self. It may keep them self-locked in one fixed state. A preserved thing could still exist, but it may not grow, change, or move forward. So if Emu's control freezes the soul, then the person may still be there, but their ability to change may be cut off. And that's where hockey becomes really important too, because hockey is the power of a person's will, right? In One Piece, willpower grows through pressure and struggle and choices and change. So if the soul is frozen, it would logically make sense that if a person's will maybe stop growing too. That didn't make any sense. It would logically make sense that a person's will may stop growing too. That doesn't mean the person is dead, it just means they're just stuck inside a version of themselves that can't move forward. That gives us the next step in the pattern. Emu's control makes the body obey, silence keeps the truth hidden, and stasis keeps the person from changing. So if that's how Emu's system works, then the opposite would be doing something that helps a person's will move again. That is where the drums of liberation come back in. With Luffy awakening Gear 5, Oda makes the heartbeat part of the transformation. The story is not only showing us that Luffy got stronger, it also makes us notice the sound that comes with the awakening, and that connects to the pattern we've just been building. Emu's side is tied to people losing control over themselves, history being erased, names being hidden, and possibly the soul being kept in one fixed state. Gear 5 pushes against all of that. I mean, Luffy's body is doing some shit. You cannot tame that beast. So if Emu's influence is all about controlling people and manually hiding the truth and keeping people stuck, then Gear 5 is moving in the other direction. It gives Luffy more freedom over his body, and the heartbeat becomes the signal that his freedom has awakened. And that leads to the next question. If the world government was really afraid of Nika, why did they spend 800 years trying to hide the fruit itself? The world government didn't treat the Nika fruit like a normal devil fruit. Most devil fruits keep their names. People know what they're called, and people generally know what the powers they give. But the Nika fruit is different. The 5 elders tell us that the fruit's real name is the Hito Hito no Mi model Nika, yet almost nobody in the world knows what that is. Instead, people know it as the Goma Goma no Mi. The 5 elders also tell us that this was done on purpose. The name was changed to hide the fruit's true identity. That is the first thing I want y'all to notice. The government didn't simply try to possess the fruit, it also hid information about the fruit. And that fits a pattern we've already been talking about. The Void Century was removed from history, the Nika fruit was hidden behind a false name. In both cases, the public was kept away from information the government did not want them to have. It shows that the government believed that the fruit's true identity was important enough to hide for centuries. So before we even get into the fruit's powers, we already know one thing. The world government wanted people to know as little about this fruit as possible, right? And here's the interesting part in all of this. After hiding the fruit's identity for centuries, the world government still had another problem. They can never seem to keep the fruit for themselves. The reason that matters is because of something the 5 elders tell us directly. They say zones have wills of their own. They knew the fruit was important, they hid its real name, they tried to control it where it went, and they still failed because God King Shanks stole it. So the pattern is really hard to ignore. Emu is one of the story's final antagonists, and the story keeps linking him to control, literally and thematically. Earlier we went over how that pattern works through control over people, over history, over names, over possibly the soul. And so when the manga tells us that zone fruits have wills of their own, and that tells us that the Nika fruit escaped the world government for 800 years, it tells us that the fruit's history fits the same control problem that we've been talking about this whole time in this video. So the next step is Gear 5. If the fruit was already difficult for the government to control before awakening, then what changes when Luffy finally awakens it? That is where the drums of liberation become important again. So when Luffy awakens Gear 5, the story introduces the drums of liberation. The important part is that this sound doesn't come from outside Luffy, it comes from his body. His heartbeat changes into a clear rhythm that others can hear. The manga hasn't explained exactly what the drums do yet, other than, I guess, make people crank that Soldier Boy or do some TikTok dance. I'm too old to understand, but it has shown us what they're connected to. So maybe the key is not only that the drums are music, maybe the key is that the music comes from Luffy's own heartbeat. If Emu's control works by forcing another will over a person's will, then a rhythm created by Luffy's own body could be important. And that brings us back to Brook, because Elbaf may already be showing us what happens when music reaches a part of someone that another will is trying to keep buried. So before we focus on Brook, there is a bigger pattern worth noticing. One Piece has used sound before to carry things that people were supposed to forget. That's why the Golden Bell of Shandora is super important. The Golden Bell was not there to defeat anybody. Its purpose was to be heard. For hundreds of years, the bell was proof that Shandora still existed. And if that idea sounds familiar, it's because Oda has been exploring the same theme in Elbaf through the Owl Library and Biblo, that the truth, knowledge, and history can't survive across generations through books, through the research of the Oharan scholars. And that's a big reason why I ended up making an entire theory about Biblo's possible connection to one of the gods worshipped by Shandora. You can check that out afterwards, but back to the Golden Bell. When Luffy rang it at the end of Skypiea, The sound reached Cricket and proved that Nolan had been telling the truth. That is important because the bell didn't explain the whole story of Shandora. It carried enough truth to prove that something buried in the past was real. The same idea shows up at the Rumbar Pirates. Long after the crew died, Binks' sake remained. The song carried the promise to Laboon across decades, and Brook survived long enough to bring that song forward so their promise didn't disappear with them. That is where Brook becomes super important. It's his connection to music that's the way his old crew's memory, promise, and emotional connection to Laboon survived. So the pattern is clear enough to matter. The Golden Bell carries proof, Binks' sake carries memory, Brook carries a promise, which pretty much spells out how in One Piece, sound often helps something from the past reach the present. Kind of like time traveling, in a sense. So if a bell can carry proof, and a song can carry memory, then we should at least ask what Luffy's heartbeat might be capable of carrying, because Elbaf may be already showing us what happens when music reaches a part of someone that another will try to bury. And that's why we have Shuri as a central character in the Elbaf arc. The story keeps showing moments where her real self pushes back to the surface. The clearest example happened when Brook recognizes her as Princess Shuri of Asperia. When Brook calls her by her real name and reminds her of her past, something changes. Imu's possession briefly disappears. Her suppressed memories begin resurfacing, and before Imu can fully reassert control, Shuri manages to warn Brook to run. It's an important moment because Brook doesn't overpower Imu. He reaches the person underneath the control, and that fits the pattern we've been building with sound carrying proof, memory, and promises forward. Then the story gives us another example beforehand through Colin. When Colin cries out for his father's scalper, Shuri reacts again. The moment connects to something personal inside her, and once again, she acts against Imu's interest by trying to help Brook before Imu forces control back into place. So the pattern isn't just that Shuri still exists somewhere inside Gunko. The pattern is that certain memories, emotions, and personal connections can make her true self break through. And that suggests Imu's control may suppress a person's identity, but it may not completely erase it. But what Imu's control is guaranteed not to do is stop you from liking the video, subscribing to the channel, clicking the bell, and hyping the video if you're enjoying this long conversation about all the ways Oda may be setting up Imu's worst nightmare through song and dance. And if that's true, then Brook's role in the storyline starts making a lot more sense. So if sound, memory, and personal connection can reach a buried identity, then the next question is what happens when that sound comes from the drum's alliteration. And what makes Brook important this time around is that he may be showing us the smaller version of the idea before the story applies it on a larger scale. Brook reaches Shuri by reminding her who she is. Colin reaches Shuri through a personal emotional trigger. In both cases, Shuri breaks through when something reaches the part of her that Imu's control is trying to cover up. Now compare that to the drum's alliteration. The drums are not just music, they're the real sound produced by Luffy's body, the embodiment of his need for freedom. Doesn't mean Brook's music and the drums alliteration can do the exact same thing. So it's pretty clear that Brook's role in this arc is helping the story explain a larger idea, that if sound and personal connection can reach a buried identity on a smaller scale, then the drums alliteration may be the larger version of that process. And if that's true, then we may have a better answer for why Imu fears Nika in the first place. Because from Imu's perspective, Nika isn't just a devil fruit. It's the same power that Joy Boy once wielded, the same power that opposed the world government during the Void Century. And every time the drums alliteration sounded, they announced the return of that power of Nika. It also makes a strange detail from the Elbaf arc much more interesting. Through the Gunko persona, Shuri admits that her greatest fear is Nika. At first, it feels like a sort of random line Oda threw in the story, but if Nika is the greatest threat to Imu's influence of control, both thematically, symbolically, and literally, then that line may not be random at all. It may be Oda quietly telling us what Imu's side fears the most. And if Nika is the thing Imu fears the most, then the final question is whether or not the drums actually matter. The final question is why they matter. Imu's control seems to work by pushing down the things that make a person themselves: memory, identity, and will. We see that pattern in the Erased Void Century, the false name given to the Nika fruit, but One Piece keeps showing us the opposite pattern too. The Golden Bell helped prove that Shandora was real, Binks' sake carried the Rumbar Pirates' promise to Laboon, and Brook's connection reached Shuri beneath Gunko. In each case, sound helps something from the past survive long enough to reach the present. That is why the drums of liberation is super important when discussing what makes Imu tick. So the real threat may not be Gear 5 by itself. The real threat may be what the drums of liberation can do to people when they hear them. And if Imu's power depends on keeping a person's real self buried, then a rhythm that can help that self answer back may be exactly the weakness Oda is setting up, which is why I think Film Red may be way more important than people realize with all this talk of music. And I explained why in this video here.